That's awesome. Just to clarify, you may wonder why I don't maintain eye contact with you, and that's obviously because I'll be watching the interpreter. So you speak as usual, as you did with Jamie, but I will be accessing the information through the interpreter. And then when I give my responses, I'll be looking between Laura and yourself.
Okay.
So, obviously the interpreter sits next to the hearing person, not next to me.
Yes.
If that makes sense. If the interpreter's on this other side, we'd be playing a tennis match.
Yes.
We'd be following the ball backward and forward. So
yes.
This setup is absolutely perfect.
Okay, good. And thank you for clarifying, because this is actually a new experience for me. So that's really great that you've kind of clarified that. That's really good.
No problems. Just thought I'd let you know that information, just so you're not thinking, oh, this is a bit strange. But you're doing absolutely perfectly by maintaining eye contact with me, with Victoria.
Awesome, great. Victoria, it would be really great if you could, to start with, just tell me a little bit about your story. You've obviously got, I was reading in your bio that you've got a real passion for New Zealand Sign and the language. And perhaps you could tell me sort of a little bit about your career and how you've ended up developing Merge, and sort of your background and where you've come from.
Okay, so sign language is my first language, and have used that ever since I was young. So then I moved to New Zealand, and there were a lot of issues for me. For example, when I was at school, the teachers here were not fluent in sign language.
Okay, yeah.
And when I would converse with adults, there were really a small number of adults that I could converse with as well. Then when I went to university, there were very few sign language interpreters. So all of my life, I've experienced these types of issues. So that's how things have been. Sorry, you wanted to say, Ellie?
So interesting. So
I know, it's like, how much information can I squeeze into this history?
Yes. I'm just really curious, so in those situations, were you just relying on being able to lip read or write things down, or how did you actually communicate at school and at university?
Well, I've used sign language from day one. That's my language.
But I mean, as far as the teachers, if they couldn't understand you, or how did you...
I taught them sign language.
Okay. Okay, great.
So that they could converse with me fluently.
Brilliant. Yeah, brilliant.
That's vital.
Yes.
This is my language. It's a visual language.
Yes.
I must have this type of communication, with my teachers. So if we kind of reverse the situation, often I might be in a situation where hearing people would be talking, to me. But for me, it was working in the opposite, where I was signing to these teachers, and it really did have an impact on their level of fluency. It's amazing the impact that a bit of, sign language vocab could have.
Yes, that's fabulous, that you did just go out and really pushed and demand, which I think is really fabulous and necessary, yeah. So I've interrupted your story, and I'm sorry, so...
No, that's absolutely fine. I think it's really important to approach teaching in a positive way. Yes. So that they feel open-minded toward that. Let's just say if you're in a cafe and I ask for a cup of tea, you can kind of gauge what I'm trying to say. So if you're reinforcing that with a positive sign afterward, and then you just build from there, and of course using gesturing as well. At varying menus, then hearing people, they're very quick learners, and they actually become quite surprised when they're able to respond back in sign language.
Yes.
And because they've found that power from within themselves, they just didn't realise that they could do it, and that the sign language was easy.
So as a language, do you feel it's a language that is fairly easy to pick up?
So we have two different groups of people. Those who already know sign language, and they become, say, sign language tutors, qualified tutors, and it's this team that offers the training. And then we have the group of students, so the learners of our language, and they all vary. It may depend on their age. It may depend if they have another language, for example, te reo Māori, French, or another spoken language. Then that would determine how quickly they may pick up the language. So if they have some previous knowledge around languages, the structure, the grammatical rules, then I would say the learning would be much quicker. Our younger generations seem to be sponges and just learn the language very quickly. For our older group of learners, it might take a little bit longer. I would say that practice is key, because the more that you practice, the better your skill becomes. And of course, as we know, if you don't use a language, then you lose it.
Yes, definitely. So if we go back to sort of talking about your career, sort of how did you sort of progress on to developing Merge?
Well, I really saw that there was a huge gap in New Zealand. There was no organisation that was really taking that initiative to offer training courses, be it online or face-to-face learning. And for example, thank you. In the entertainment area, any live performances, it really wasn't kind of visible. It was almost like it was underground, that it was just the deaf community that was using the language. So really for us, it was to tap into that and to showcase this to the world. It's a beautiful language, and it's a language to be embraced by our community, by all of our communities, because there are so many benefits to using sign language. I'm very passionate, which is why I'm involved. And of course, Jamie is the other half of our organisation, so we have that shared vision. And that really motivated us just to get going with it. It's been a year, and there have been so many things that have happened, and you just realise that there are so many other gaps and how much more work there is to do. So it really has taken off.
Fantastic. Do you think that, so just picking up from what you've said, do you feel that New Zealand is perhaps behind other countries in its promotion of New Zealand Sign? And you were talking about sort of the theatre and having someone there to sign or providing resources for the deaf community. Do you feel that New Zealand is sort of behind perhaps other countries in its...
difficult to sum that up in one answer.
Yeah.
Because some countries say maybe more advanced in deaf education, and whereas New Zealand, there's a lot of work in this area to be done. New Zealand, however, have much better legislation.
Yes.
And so the government's support for the development of sign language is greater than, say, other countries.
Okay.
Employment, it covers off areas of employment, and so it really does depend country to country, the pros and cons. But watch this space, watch New Zealand, because we are a more compact country, we're much smaller. It means that we work together. And of course, amongst our own, there is that politics that still takes place. But I think that we are actually seen as world leaders.
Okay, fantastic. That's good. That's very good. Can you talk a little bit about the deaf community and about the culture? So Jamie sort of mentioned a few things that she'd sort of observed, but in your, being your community and also New Zealand Sign being your first language, what would you sort of notice, I think, can you sort of talk about some cultural aspects that are sort of very specific to that, to you?
culture, everyone knows generally what culture is. If we look at other cultural groups, they identify themselves through traditional clothing, maybe art, music, maybe particular dance, particular food. When we talk about deaf culture, it's actually challenging for us to say, well, here's our culture. Because what is it?
Yeah, what is
we
it?
don't have specific clothing. We don't have specific food. It's something more innate.
Yeah.
It's our way of thinking, our way of doing things. It's probably more an invisible culture. I would say that we have amongst us all a collective agreement. If there are any developments or changes, then within the deaf community, this is discussed. And I think that probably links into pride of being deaf. And I say deaf with a capital D. So we will identify and say, I'm deaf with a capital D. Which means I use sign language first and foremost, be it in education, my access to information is via sign language, employment and the like.
So just going back to that capital D, can you kind of clarify, does that mean that you are really proud to be deaf and to be using New Zealand Sign? Is that what that capital D, that's what you're meaning? Yep.
Correct.
Yes.
Yes. So a lot of people amongst our community, I mean, how do I sum it up? We're different. You know, we're just a cool group of people, and the outside world seems to look in and think, but you can't hear music. You can't hear the birds tweeting away. But for me, I kind of think, well, hang on a moment. I am so grateful I have these tools. I have this visual communication that I access. My world is so much more vivid.
Yes.
And of course, for our international deaf visitors, for example, if I say head off to quite a unique country, you know, I would stay with a deaf family. It doesn't matter, you know, whether we've known each other previously or not. It's these connections, it's that bond that the community has, and that is really, really powerful. So we make these connections all over the world. There are 70 million deaf throughout the world. So, you know, making those connections and keeping them are much easier.
Yes.
Communication with other people from overseas, we can just communicate just like that. No barrier. It's just that instant communication.
Fantastic. What would you say, you know, leading on from there, what would you say were the sort of main misunderstandings about your community, by the hearing community?
So there are different levels of misunderstanding. For example, like Jamie's already talked to you about eye contact, and to look away from a deaf person is very, very rude. The interaction between two people. On a much deeper level, there are a lot of things that happen. For example, so hearing people assume that deaf people are unable to do for themselves, and often will take over, don't worry, I'll do that for you. No, you know, because your English isn't so great, I'll support you with that. And as a deaf community, we value independence, but just, you know, give us that opportunity to develop that, you know, to let us get going with that. So there's a huge misunderstanding out there around this. Perhaps a deaf person may not have a specific skill set, but give us the opportunity to develop that. Give us that opportunity to build that skill, so that increases our knowledge base to then participate in that. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
For example, let's talk about the education sector or the health sector. Often there are a lot of high-level positions where hearing people are making decisions on behalf of deaf children without having a strong perspective from our deaf community, from our adults specifically. So, that's another, misgiving that's out there.
What do you feel that the benefit would be? So, I mean, obviously this is all about your organisation and Merge and your vision, but what do you think the benefit would be for if everyone could say the basic things in sign language? If obviously there's been implication for the deaf community in the sense that it would be much easier for them to, like you said, to be able to do things and learn and develop for themselves, but also there must be additional benefits to everybody. What do you think? I mean, and that's obviously part of your vision. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Sure. So in New Zealand, really it's for people to have that undertaking to appreciate the language as we have it. For deaf people out there to be able to access information, access services and the like. And for hearing people, if you understand sign language, facial expressions, it would transform your professional development, your own, personal development. Because, hearing people use their hands without realising it. You're gesturing all of the time. You're making these types of, hand movement. It's like, okay, for us in sign language, that's, a comparison. It might be this or that. You're also using space. Facial expression. You raise your eyebrows. And we use that in sign language to ask questions.
But in sign language, it's so much more intentional, isn't it? Whereas we're just using it without having any kind of awareness of what we're doing. So
that's exactly right. You just don't realise it, but it's just, it's on a much lower level. But if you had that awareness around it, and once you get into a sign language class and you start to learn all the different facets of the language, you're like, sure, this is it. Yes, now I understand the benefits.
Yes.
And, you think about long distance conversations, screaming from one person to another person in the room, whereas in sign language, you could have that same conversation and save your voice.
Yes.
You could chat through a window, rather than walking all the way out to have that conversation with someone. So it's really these little things that are overlooked. And so sign language can actually be very, very empowering to everybody. I'd say it's also useful in a factory environment, in a bar, in a classroom, noisy places. You just come into a classroom and you settle the class down and the kids just quieten down.
Yes.
So sign language has power, and these gestures are being used and understood already.
Absolutely, and I can already get a sense just from talking to you and talking to Jamie about how the use of sign language can really help with confidence and communicate at a deeper level.
Absolutely. And the confidence is developed because it encourages you to step outside yourself, because now it's almost like you're being under the spotlight. You're being seen for the language that you're using.
Yes.
So it also helps your public speaking skills, to be able to talk in sign language, to use sign language. So really that light actually comes from within, and it's just radiating out, and so people are watching.
Yes.
And so, and we would just like to really encourage that light and make more.
Fantastic. One question that I know we're sort of pushed for time, but there's one question just that goes, talking about that sort of light. And Brittany and we learnt our names in sign language, and I was actually thinking when I was doing that, but this is actually using English. And I wanted to ask you about sign names And to me that makes a lot of sense because my name has nothing to do with me or my personality. It doesn't really say anything about me. So I was going to ask you about what's the process of that, creating sign names, and presumably that is much more significant to you as an individual?
Yes, we do have quite a special process around sign names. For our deaf community, again, we go back to that collective agreement, as I mentioned earlier. So if somebody, a newcomer into our community is relatively small, so you're a newcomer into that community, so we suss you out a little bit. We say, okay, what's Ali's personality like? What's her appearance like? Does she have a particular habit, something that is just repetitive and quite unique to you? Or else it could be based on English. So for example, MJ, okay? So that's just using English, MJ. So it would take time. And then if a deaf community member agrees to give you a sign name, then that has to be agreed amongst that community. So if you're given that sign name by, say one person or two people, and then basically it sticks and that becomes your sign name.
Yes.
It's with you. So once you receive that sign name, it's yours for life.
Okay. Can I ask you what your sign name is?
This is my sign name, Victoria, because I blush so much. When I moved to New Zealand, I was a highly assertive person within the community, but I was struggling with sign language, and so I would get frustrated, but then I would blush continually, and I was teased, and and it was almost as if I was just going to burst at the seams, and that was just me, and they assigned me that name sign, and it is taken as a gift. It's taken as a gift, yes. It's a gift that's given.
How fantastic. Thank you so much for talking to me today. I really appreciate it. I've really enjoyed talking to you. I wish I could talk to you some more, actually.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You're welcome. And this is a sign for thank you.
This? Yes. Okay.
Thank you, Brittany.